I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Dean Detloff.
And I'm your other co-host, Matt Bernico. Folks, before we even get into anything, before anything else happens, before the revelations are revealed, we have a book that's coming out so soon. It's coming out in the next few weeks on May 12th. It's called Enough is Enough, Degrowth, Capitalism, and Liberation Theology. You can go buy it right now from Fortress Press. Well, you can pre-order it right now. We've been noticing, however, some people are getting this book a little bit early. So if you pre-ordered it right now, maybe you'd get it really quick. Who knows? You could be amongst the 144,000 white robe martyrs who received the book early. Or maybe you couldn't. You never know. But you should definitely buy it. It's really cool. If you like our podcast, if you've been interested in the things that we've been saying on it, this is the book for you. So get it, give it to your friends, your family, ask your library to buy it for you. You got to get this book. It's going to be the hottest book of the summer. I'm calling it right now.
Yeah, everybody's going to be reading it. You don't want to be the only one at the pool who's not reading it. We worked pretty hard on it, and it's also the fruit of a lot of thinking on this podcast over lots of years. So I think, as you said, if you like this podcast, you'll like that particular book. Some highlights. There's a great chapter in there about all the weird degrowth stuff in the Bible. So you can do a good Bible study with your church. There's a chapter in there on Laudato Si. You can talk to your Catholic priest about it. Truly something for everyone. You can get it also at your local bookstore or wherever you get books. And I think it's going to be interesting to see what kind of life it takes on now that it is released into the world. We wrote it before the Strait of Hormuz was even something in the news. So a lot has changed since we wrote it. But I think it'll be interesting to see what happens. Matt, what's your favorite part of the book that we wrote?
Okay, the best part of the book. This isn't my favorite. This is just the best part. The best part of the book is the concluding chapter where we talk about whales. And right. The whales are really great. Here's something, a peek behind the scenes, though, about these whales. I read a whole book about whales. And then none of that content made it into the chapter, but I did. It was getting me in the right headspace to think about whales. So that's cool. I think that is great.
There are a few other secret books that have been written and cut out of this one book. One of them is definitely about whales. There's a few more in there. Also, not to brag, but we did interview Leonardo Boff, Brazilian liberation theologian Leonardo Boff, for the book, and his comments are in there. I feel pretty proud of that. I feel like it's a good contribution. So get the book. It officially releases May 12th, but you too could be one of the elect if you order it now and get it in the mail. If you get it, or if you already have it, take a picture of it, tag us on social media, and we'll share it around, and that will really help us build the buzz that we need to get to the top of the charts. What do we want to be? I guess we want to be number one in, I don't know how our book is categorized, but I'm going to say Christian living. We want to beat Beth Moore. That's the goal here.
That's right. Get out of the way, Beth Moore. We're going right to the top. People need to know about the whales.
Beth Moore? More like Beth Less.
More like Beth Bohr, because her book isn't exciting as ours. I've never read a Beth Moore book, and I don't know anything about her. All of the things I know about Beth Moore are the things that Mason Menenga has ever said about her on Twitter. So not very much. All right, so that's great. Buy her book. In conclusion, Buy our book, please. This week we're continuing on with our great reading plan, our great summer reading plan that I guess we started in January. We're going to continue on with Chapter 7 of Apocalypse, A People's Commentary on the Book of Revelation by Pablo Richard. Let's see. If you're tuning in for the first time this week, what you need to know is that we've become really obsessed with the Book of Revelation and all of the weird things that it means. Okay, but we've become really obsessed in like a healthy, not end timesy in the evangelical sense kind of way.
Well, that remains to be seen. We haven't finished the book.
That's true. We could change course at any moment. The things that we found so far, just kind of in a big recap, are that the Book of Revelation is largely about anti-imperialism. It's about Christianity's entanglement and rejection of empire and sort of the oftentimes like the shortcomings that Christian communities have had engaging with empire. And there's also a lot of weird stuff in this book that we've kind of been picking apart as we go through, and we'll get more weird stuff today as well. The last episode you heard had some stuff in there about some beasts, comets falling from heaven, wars in heaven, all kinds of wild and crazy stuff. This week we're talking about Revelation 17:1 through 19:10. Pablo Richard says that this section of text has like one big smooth flow to it, so that's why he's taking it together. And we're on the precipice of a really important point in Revelation. We've kind of gone through the majority of the like action and turmoil and God murdering of fourth of humanity or whatever. And we have this stuff today in chapter 7, and then what lies before us is the end of history, the end of all things, the great resolution of this book. So we're getting really close to the end, which is great, but also kind of bad because then we have to figure out a different book to read. And it's been so nice just to be able to do this one every week. Dean, what do you think so far?
Well, so far, let's see. There have been some remaining challenges, and we're going to let them remain challenges, I think, until next week when we conclude the book. But we'll get into some of it today, in particular, issues around Revelation is a book of resistance to Roman Empire. But what that resistance looks like and what kind of shapes it takes, I think that is an open question. Pablo Richard is going to give a hot take about what it looks like, and I guess we can talk through whether or not that seems convincing or what we can pull out of it. But that's one that's been on my mind. What does resistance look like? Also, the nature of kind of violence and vengeance. That's been kind of an ongoing challenge and issue, and one we'll return to in this chapter. And finally, another item that we can talk more about is the gendered kind of imagery in the text. So lots of women in particular doing both good and bad things alongside men, but women kind of serve a unique symbolic purpose in the book, and we will talk about that this time around too. So I think that overall, so far, I feel convinced that Revelation is a very interesting anti-imperialist mythological tract, a great kind of pamphlet about encouraging an anti-imperialist imagination among the early church. Exactly what that commits you to do, that's an open question that I am excited to figure out with you together today, Matt.
All right, let's figure it out. Pablo Richard says that this section of Revelation is a triptych, like a 3-paneled painting is kind of the, I don't know, I think he's trying to be accessible by calling it a triptych, but I think it's not very accessible. Anyways, the triptych, the 3 panels here is panel 1, we have the beast and the harlot. We'll talk more about those characters in a minute. The panel 2 is the judgment upon the great Babylon. That's also the harlot. So we have sort of a vision at first, then we have a judgment second, a kind of courtroom drama. And then finally, we have what Richard calls the liturgy of the final victory. This is like the signaling the moment where like the work is done. God has established his reign on earth, and there's sort of like this like other big thing that happens. The wedding day of the Lamb is what it's called in Revelation. So very interesting. So we have the triptych. We have these 3 things. Let's get into it. So much of Revelation is John saying, and then an angel showed me a vision. And this part in Revelation is no different than any of those other parts. John sees a vision. John sees the harlot, which is a stand-in for Rome. So whenever we hear the word harlot, you can always just imagine Rome, the city. He sees the harlot in the desert, and then Richard clarifies here, saying, here, the desert is not a symbol of Exodus, like in previous parts of Revelation, where like the Exodus story is kind of behind the scenes going on as like a intertextual moment. But instead, we have the desert signaling desolation, a place where demons and savage beasts dwell. So that is the first part of the vision. So we have a harlot, and that is, like Dean mentioned a minute ago, some gendered language, though Richard will go on to tell us that it's actually can refer to a female or male. But I still think that there's a lot of like uncomfortableness in me about the image of the prostitute, the image of the harlot. It's doing something really particular within the mythology of Revelation, but you can't really read it without all of the patriarchal baggage coming along with it. So maybe we can talk about that before we get any further into things.
Yeah. It's interesting because Richard does want to give you like the most maximally progressive and kind of liberating interpretation of the Book of Revelation that he possibly can. And insofar as he does try to do that, it's interesting and cool, but it kind of maybe like, I don't know, it's not very satisfactory, at least to me, in explaining away some of the issues. For example, this whole kind of triptych revolves around identifying Rome, which throughout this book we have learned is like an extremely brutal, violent, awful, oppressive figure, with the figure of a sex worker prostitute. And there's all kinds of stuff involved with her in particular. She is seated on the beast, who we learned about a little while ago. She has all these kind of symbols of wealth. She has a lot of gold involved. She drinks the blood of the martyrs in this kind of like perverse anti-Eucharistic scene, which is pretty nuts. A very yucky kind of lady overall. That's what Revelation is trying to depict. And Richard tries to say, I guess we can discuss why the prostitution metaphor, like what it is doing here in a minute, because it also doesn't come out of nowhere and there's a long history to it. But Richard tries to say, as you mentioned, that prostitution in Revelation, at least as like a metaphor, is a kind of, it's not a gender specific metaphor per se, because, as we'll talk about later, there are a handful of kings who are like, they've kind of given themselves over to Rome. They too are depicted as prostituting their power or prostituting themselves. So there's a kind of, I don't know, anybody can be a bad prostitute in the Book of Revelation, I guess, which Richard says is at least good that it's not only women. And Richard also goes out of his way to say that when we're interpreting Revelation, you have to be mindful of the fact that the denigration of prostitution does open up the possibility of violence against sex workers in our own world, which is great that Richard sees that, I guess, and, doesn't want to, like, Richard's own interpretation isn't to say, like, prostitute equals bad, but the narrative of Revelation very clearly is doing that. So Richard is trying his best to, like, I guess, be alive to the fact that you could kind of, you could like walk away with some bad interpretations of this text, but he says, don't worry, you don't have to. I kind of feel like maybe he's working a little too hard to try to save the text, and it might actually be better to say that maybe this is also written in a patriarchal society and is also reproducing the problems of that society and is bad. There's kind of like a tendency in Richard to assume that like John of Patmos is secretly the great liberation theologian who is like kind of correct in every sense, and he'll do every single thing that he can to try to save John from himself. But there are many places, as we've talked about elsewhere in the podcast, where I feel like he doesn't do a good job of doing that, or maybe like it's not clear to me why you need to save him when you could just be like, well, he made a mistake, we shouldn't do that. But in any case, he's trying to do that. What do you think, Matt, about that whole kind of gender discourse going on here?
Yeah, I feel, like I said, I feel uncomfortable about it because, I mean, the progressive reading is complicated, and I think not worth saving. I mean, I think my approach to this would just be like, yeah, I don't know, John of Patmos shouldn't have said those things. This is not a good metaphor. It's such a weird thing to be like, yes, the most brutal and like the most powerful and brutal stand-in for Rome is a sex worker, which is wild because like the most vulnerable people in the society. I don't know, such a just unapt comparison, I think. The other thing that I think is interesting, I guess this is just a problem when you're trying to come up with something completely new, like a new mythos to explain something. But even your new mythos to explain something, like all of this like wild stuff in Revelation, it can't escape the logic of the time and the place and the background and all of your assumptions. So, you just can't escape that orbit. You're always, even in your like new created world that you've put into writing, with all of these like dragons and stars and stuff, you're still, repeating the same assumptions that you've always had about women or sex workers. And I don't know, just a problem of being a human person that lives in time and space. But also, the response to that should just be, and it sucks, like, and that's bad.
Yeah, I agree. Just to maybe contextualize a little bit more about where the metaphor comes from, because I think it's important at least to understand like what the metaphor is saying, even though we should pick a better metaphor and should say that this is maybe not the optimal way to deliver on this point. But the point that's being made is interesting to learn about anyway. The imagery around prostitution is a kind of long-standing, interesting issue in the Bible itself. Marika Rose has done some really cool stuff on sex work in the Bible, which you should definitely read. And man, we should probably just have her on here and talk to her about this specific passage. Maybe we'll do that later this year. I don't know. But you often find these kinds of even like prophetic plays using prostitution or like illicit marriage or all these other kinds of things as metaphors for idolatry in particular. So throughout the Old Testament, you get lots of comparisons to Israel or to other states as being prostitutes of some kind or other, sex workers of some kind or other. You have prophets even marrying sex workers as a kind of like extremely bizarre pageant to illustrate, how Israel is treating God or whatever. Lots of weird psychosexual theological stuff happening in here. But all that to say, the image that Richard wants to kind of drive home is that prostitution equals idolatry. That's like the fundamental explanatory purpose of the metaphor in the Old Testament and also in the book of Revelation. And insofar as that's the case, there's a kind of interesting thing where the image is that Rome is kind of like seducing the powers of the world to kind of give their agency over to Rome. That's like the fetishization of power that happens in idolatry. So you get seduced by some other kind of power, in this case Rome. You give up your own agency to that agent, and then everything that you do kind of serves the purposes of that particular idol. So that's the purpose of the metaphor. Again, whether or not it's effective, that, I think we would say is not not the case. But interesting anyway that that's kind of the idea here. And also the sort of like perverse Eucharist, or, the fact that like the seductive power of Rome is made possible by absorbing the lifeblood of the martyrs, or kind of, like Rome is sustained by the blood of the people. That's like the kind of bigger point. The fact that the woman is riding the beast is also very interesting, and probably worth talking about the beast a little bit more in detail. But I don't know, Matt, anything else to say about this particular woman, the harlot of Empire?
Yeah, maybe a few things. Well, let's go along here with Richard for a minute. So we have the harlot, who is a stand-in for Rome. That's like sort of like the mythological symbol. And like you mentioned, the harlot is riding the beast, which is like signaling that they are sort of spiritually in sync. We talked a little bit about this in previous episodes about how, it's that like the beast gives Rome its power. But then also like there's this also kind of like continued back and forth where like money is also giving Rome its power, and like and money is giving its power from the beast, all this kind of stuff. I'm returning to the big corkboard with strings. We're like 10 minutes in this podcast and I'm already like sticking new cards up on the wall. So the harlot is riding the beast, but the important thing that Richard kind of points out to us is that he says Rome is not only a harlot, but the mother of all harlots. Rome is thus seen to be the source and prototype of all the idolatry dominating the empire. I think this is actually a really interesting bit of analysis here. That I mean, it comes right out of Revelation, because it's recognizing that there is like form and substance to this whole thing. Like Rome is an expression of this type of idolatry in the world, of the beast, right? But Rome is also not the ultimate expression. There could be all kinds of other bits, all kinds of other empires that have existed in the past that also fall into this like same sort of like beastly category. I mean, earlier in Revelation, we hear a little bit about Egypt, we hear about Babylon. In this one, we have Tyre as well. And I think that's actually I guess what's interesting about that to me is that it points towards like a larger political analysis going on in Revelation, that the empire itself, you know, all of these empires, no matter if it's Rome or Babylon or the United States or whatever, they all are powered by the blood of the martyrs, right? They are all powered by the people who they exploit. And that's super interesting. And man, there's like so much actually that comes right after that. But I think that when we have John of Patmos, you know, he's using a metaphor that I don't particularly like, and I think actually can do real harm in the world. But that being the case, even through this sort of mythology, you can see like what he's reaching for. This is like a pretty wide ranged explanation of like why imperialism is bad, but expressed in like a really explicitly religious way through like, you know, all this religious mythology.
Yeah, it is, as we've talked about before, going through this book, it is actually like a pretty profoundly kind of structural critique of even the economics of empire. The fact that you know, the woman is like adorned with gold, she drinks out of a gold goblet, like she's clearly kind of, I don't know, like absorbing the economic benefits of the blood of the people as well. There's a lot of violence underneath the economy that kind of makes the economy go. That's all very unique and interesting. Her sitting atop the beast is also pretty wild. Richard notes that there are these kind of like three moments in the kind of vision that talk through what that looks like what the kind of how the vision changes and how the according kind of critique of empire and its pretense to power changes. So maybe we can talk through those really quick. The first moment in it is that the beast has 7 heads, which represent 7 kings. 5 have already fallen, 1 still lives, and the last has not yet come. Now, we talked about that last week, so we don't have to go through all that over again. The key thing to remember here is that the number 7 represents a kind of number of perfection. And so insofar as the beast is like pretending to get to that level of perfection, what we have here is 5 kings have come, the 6th is currently living, so that means it's kind of just short of perfection. The 7th one has yet to come, but you know what we know is that the beast can't actually be complete. And so the vision goes on to say that when that 7th king comes, he will only remain for a short while. Richard's key point here is that the number 6 and 666 are kind of expressing that the beast will always try to achieve perfection, but it's always just out of reach. Like it can't quite get there. It's unsustainable. So there's a second kind of moment, which is where the book says that the beast is an 8th king. So when the Roman emperor, the 7th kind of perfect emperor, whatever, tries to become perfect, and that inevitably fails, there will be this 8th attempt, but really that too will fail. And that leads to a third moment where the Roman Empire is headed for destruction. And this is kind of, I think, the most interesting bit. We can talk through the other two if we want to, but the key is that Rome keeps trying to become perfect. It even claims to be perfect. That can't really last. There's like a sort of like entropy or entropic power involved in imperialism. And in the end, that kind of entropy actually turns inward, and finally the empire starts to devour itself. There's kind of like an internal chaos. And that I think is really fascinating, because throughout Revelation, we've seen a lot of external attempts to kind of judge Rome or poke at Rome or destroy parts of Rome. But finally, the empire kind of turns in on itself. And in a weird way, it's like, I don't know how well this metaphor works, but it kind of strikes me as like the ancient version of the kind of imperial boomerang thesis, you know, like you go out and you subjugate the world using the kind of tools of colonial domination. But eventually those tools will return to your own shores and kind of eat you alive from the inside. So there's something like that going on, which is pretty interesting. Richard adds that in a way that internal devouring is the result of imperial logics kind of becoming recursive, but also it's kind of hastened by Christians who refuse to participate in Rome and who are showing an alternative. So there's this combination of like the self-destructive nature of imperialism plus the fact that there actually does appear to be an alternative. And that's why it matters that Christians kind of take themselves out of the Roman economic circulation. That stuff is all very interesting. So once again, the beast, I guess, is such a powerful and bizarre and weird metaphor for the really wild machinations of empire.
Yeah, that part is extremely interesting. Man, there's so much so much to think through, I guess. Pablo Richard says, we encountered the description of a future internal crisis in the empire. The 10 horns and the beast are going to hate the harlot. This is in the text of Revelation, that they hate the harlot. And that they will leave her alone and naked, and then they will eat her flesh and consume her with fire. And he says this is drawing on Ezekiel 16 and 23. So go look those up if you really want to, I guess. And then he goes on to say that we encounter the description of a future internal crisis in the empire. Oh, whoops, nope. Okay. He goes on to say, the entire Roman Empire, with all its local and provincial powers, hates Rome and destroys it. John may not be referring to any specific historical event, but to the internal process of destruction that an empire undergoes when it has turned into the beast. That is super interesting, though, because especially at a time when so many people are talking about the cool zone in American history, you know, talking about, I mean, I don't know, there's a podcast that's called It Could Happen Here about the collapse of the United States. And there's a lot of like fascination and fantasization about the collapse of the US empire. And like, I don't know, you can kind of draw a parallel between these two things. You know, to some it might not really make sense that like what does it mean that like there are parts of Rome that hates Rome? You know, there are parts of the Roman Empire that hates the Roman Empire. And it's like, I don't know, it's actually pretty understandable when you think about it in the US context. Like there are all kinds of parts of the US Empire that hates the US Empire. And you know, those parts that hate the US Empire are like completely at odds with one another in a lot of different ways, right? Like there's a conservative reading to that, there's a left-wing reading to that, and so on. There's also just like sort of black-pilled nihilism going on there as well. But the description of like, you know, the empire turning in on itself and imploding or collapsing, I don't know, whichever direction the explosion's going, who can say, is such an interesting thing to throw into a big prophetic book. But it makes sense. I'm into it. I think it's really interesting.
I agree. And yeah, just to pull one more thread. So we mentioned there are 7 heads who represent these kind of 7 kings, and then eventually an 8th king. So these represent the Roman emperor, according to Richard. So maybe also to kind of like stack all these metaphors on top of each other, you have the harlot, who is kind of like, in a way, the kind of stand-in for the spiritual allure of idolatry, that you want to give your fidelity or allegiance over to Rome. And she sits on top of the beast. And so then the heads are the emperor. The beast also has 10 horns, which Richard says represent 10 kings. I mean, the Bible says it represents 10 kings. But the kings are also not necessarily specific kings. Instead, Richard says that they're sort of, they're kingdomless kings. They don't actually have land per se. They're just like people who have power within the Roman imperial system, and they're trying to also like shore up that imperial system. But as you just mentioned, eventually they turn against the beast in this complicated way. And that kind of maybe goes on to, again, just kind of show the, the imperial divisions within the kind of Game of Thrones going on in and as the beast itself. Nevertheless, all these forces are aligned against the Lamb, and that's the big contradiction here. So there are two important beasts or animals here in this moment. You have the big yucky beast, and you have the lamb that has already been slain. So that's what's going on. We have this kind of like parallelism. And finally, as we'll see later on, there's also a parallel woman here, which is the bride of the Lamb, namely the church. Or Richard says even more broadly, all those who have suffered at the hands of the Empire, they kind of make up the bride of the Lamb. So you have the the sinful, illicit, yucky marriage, or not even marriage, the kind of union, at least, of the harlot or the sex worker or whatever that John is parsing out here with the beast. But then you have like the good marriage between the Lamb and the people who've been oppressed. I'm sure lots of extremely interesting feminist theology about that maybe we can look at more later this year, but that's kind of the parallel in the book itself, which is quite interesting. I think there's more to say about this kind of triptych with the woman and the beast and all that kind of stuff. But the second panel is maybe even more interesting to us, Matt. So I want to pull us there, if you'll abide me to do that.
Yeah, I just want to talk about these kings more, but no, let's not. Let's keep going.
Okay, so we've seen the first panel of this triptych, which is the scene we've been describing. But the second panel in this 3-panel painting, according to Richard, is a panel that has to do with judgment in particular. Last week, we said we got so caught up with talking about the beast that we didn't have time to talk about resistance to the beast. And thankfully, that theme comes about again here in this particular chapter by Richard. The whole time, we've been wondering what is going to happen to Rome. We've seen the bowls getting poured out, the trumpets getting blasted, all kinds of bad stuff happening to Rome. But how does it finally kind of meet its demise, and who does it? That's the big kind of question of this triptych, which is the judgment panel in particular. In the beginning of Revelation, you might remember that the martyrs in heaven were crying out to God and saying, like, when are you going to avenge us? You said you'd do it. So this is the moment when God does do it. I'll just read quickly a kind of trial scene, according to Richard, the basic details of that, and then we can talk through what this judgment looks like and what it might mean for kind of the political vision of Revelation. So Richard says, chapter 18 presents us with a real trial scene. We have the judge, or God, the defendant, Rome, the accusers, the prophets, holy ones, and all those slain by Rome, the accusation, murder caused by idolatry and the accumulation of wealth, evidence, blood found in the city, the sentence, Rome found guilty, and the execution of the sentence, Rome cast down, never to be found again. The effects of that judgment on Rome, on kings, merchants, and sailors, the joy that erupts when those for whom justice has been done hear the sentence, and the post-trial celebration by those who were oppressed by Rome. So that's the brief kind of series here, and Richard, here's maybe the controversial reading. He says, this symbolic or mythical representation of the trial of Rome is not a catharsis, purification of the spirit, or sublimation of the passions through a representation, as was the case with Greek tragedies. Nor is it an outburst of popular rage. What the author seeks in this chapter is to restore the awareness of the Christian community. The central element is the historical thrust of God's justice. The trial involves a discernment into reality and a prophetic vision of history. So that's the pitch that Richard is going to make, that this big trial scene that ends with the definitive defeat of Rome is not about catharsis. It's not about the desire for vengeance. It's actually about activating Christian consciousness about the empire. So I guess, Matt, we can maybe test that thesis together here.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, I am not I'm not so sure about that. In a few episodes ago, we talked a lot about, especially I think it was in a few episodes ago, I think it was in the bowls and trumpets episode. We heard all of these I don't know, bits from Revelation about the wrath of God, like murdering people left and right. And that felt very much Sigh of the Oppressed Creature we discussed. That's people who are powerless expressing their powerlessness through sort of religious language. And I mean, like, fair enough, that's what people do. Whatever. And I don't know though. I'm not sure if I'm won over that this is still anything more than that. Maybe like at its best, that's what this could be. If we want to read it generously, I guess that's fine. But I don't know if it comes across that way to me in particular. How do you feel, Dean?
I feel the same way. And I think that the open question we've had throughout the book here of like, what does resistance to Rome actually look like remains open for me. So I don't know. Maybe we can figure out some more of the contours of it, but I'm not convinced either. Okay. Well, here's a little bit more about resistance then from Richard. So Richard keeps kind of talking through this second triptych in Revelation here. And he's, going through all of these bits. And there's a bit where God tells the people who are psyched about Rome's defeat. God tells the people to render to her as she herself has rendered and repay her double for her deeds. So this is Richard tells us this is like really specifically God telling people to like do something. And I read that bit and I was like, oh, that's awesome. This will be a very interesting bit to see like what Richard does with all of this. But then he says he has kind of some clarifying bits that I'm not so sure about. I think they're interesting, but I'm not so sure. So Richard says, how can the people of God do such a thing to Rome? That is, to repay Rome double for the things that Rome has done to them. Obviously, Richard says, the people of God must not and cannot use the same violence against Rome that Rome has used against it. The first command was to leave Rome, implying thereby that combat with her is not to be the same ground, nor with the same weapons. The people of God actually combat Rome, but its weapons are different and more effective, doubly so, in fact. The best New Testament description of this combat is in Ephesians 6:10 through 20, and then in parentheses, read this passage. The passage, sorry, and if your Bible quizzer knowledge is not up to snuff in this particular moment, Ephesians 6:10 through 20 is the full armor of God, putting on the breastplate of righteousness, the belt of truth. That's not one of them. I don't know. You know what I'm talking about, though. We can talk about it more specifically. The Bible knowledge. That's right. The sword of not smiting people violently, apparently. Richard goes on to say that the passage on which we are commenting indicates a particular historical practice of God's people against Rome. Today we would call this non-violent struggle, cultural, ethical, and spiritual resistance, but not thereby any less effective or real. God's people struggles against Rome, as did Jesus, by dying and rising. Okay. I'm not against nonviolence. In fact, I love not being violent. One of my favorite things is to not be violent. So don't get me wrong. I'm not mad about that. I'm not mad about that at all. But I am thinking about this through the perspective of like struggles of oppressed people, I guess is where I'm coming from. And it is not unusual to find, violence in struggles of oppressed people. I mean, the example that we go to all the time is Nicaragua, and the ways that Christians were expressly involved in that that revolution, and there was violence. I don't know. Regrettable, but like that's the way things happen, I suppose. Maybe not even regrettable sometimes. Listen, I'm not an ethicist. I don't know anything about this, but I'm just trying to say that people use violence to obtain political means, and that is like, sometimes just, sometimes unjust. I guess the thing that really bothers me about this whole thing that Richard has here is that he says, obviously the people of God must not and cannot use violence. And I don't really know why that's obvious. Like to me, that doesn't feel obvious because it feels like that is the thing that, most likely happens in situations where there is an oppressor and an oppressed. It seems like that is where violence is often commanded. So I'm not saying that it needs to, or as a fact, but I don't know why exactly it's obvious, and I'm not sure
just not sure about it. It is probably the case that Richard is correct, though. Like, the early church was nonviolent. They were pacifists in a lot of big ways. I mean, in ways that probably, pacifist is like a anachronism, or trying to apply a word that may not have existed at the moment to a group of people. But it just doesn't. This all just kind of doesn't sit with me, right? It seems a little bit too easy, I guess, is how I feel.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if it was only a matter of being like, keep on being nonviolent and doing what you're doing, it feels like that doesn't square very well with the the pretty funny comment by the Book of Revelation where it says, you are just in passing this sentence, for they have shed the blood of the holy ones and the prophets, and you have given them blood to drink. It is what they deserve. It's like, I don't know, like the kind of like piling on of vengeance here in particular. Yeah. Maybe that's not calling for armed rebellion. I think that would also be an incorrect reading here. But like, if you were just telling people that, you should just keep kind of resisting in a nonviolent way, it wouldn't really make rhetorical sense to like convince them that, don't worry, that might feel very yucky to you, but actually it's not. It's good. Like that doesn't feel like the natural reaction. So yeah, I mean, there's something very weird going on in the text, and I think Richard has like kind of at least highlighted that in a way that's good. And I'd like to look at some other commentaries to figure out how they work this out too, because it is unclear to me. Like, it doesn't, like I said, it doesn't seem like he's calling for some kind of armed insurrection here. But at the same time, to read it as like, just do what Martin Luther King did or something, that seems like too weak of a reading of the kind of scale and degree of intense judgment that is falling on the Roman Empire. I mean, Richard, I think, wants to interpret that intensity by saying spiritual struggle is actually more intense than we assume, or by saying that it's like, also a kind of very significant kind of struggle, and so the rhetoric is like ratcheting up the spiritual struggle, but that seems like ported in there in a pretty ham-fisted way.
To me, it does just like, it reads more as just like resentment. Again, I don't know. Mm-hmm. I don't want it to be that. I like Richard's reading more than I like my like pessimism about it, I guess. So maybe I should just shut up and like go with it. But it's difficult. It's difficult to just swallow it because something seems like not quite right about it all.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so let's bookmark that. Let's put a big special pin in our corkboard on that one, related to resistance. We don't know exactly what that looks like, and maybe we can think more about that later. Let's go, though, to talking a little bit more about the fall of Rome, because that actually does continue to kind of deepen the structural analysis of the Roman Empire in an interesting way. So, Rome has fallen. Exactly how, exactly what the role of Christians were in it, who could say? But when it falls, the reactions to it are really quite interesting. So Richard points out that three groups are wailing here when Rome falls. They are the kings of the earth, which represent political power, the merchants of the earth, which represent economic power, and seafaring merchants, which represent trading power. And the text speaks for itself, says Richard, with no further explanation necessary. But yeah, don't even worry about it. You know what he's talking about. But there is a really funny kind of detailed description, Richard says, of Rome's consumer products. These are the things that are, I don't know, like being affected. And they are metals, including gold and silver, jewels, precious metals and pearls, fine cloth, linen, purple silk, scarlet cloth, materials, fragrant wood, ivory, expensive wood, bronze, iron, and marble, scents, cinnamon, spice, myrrh, and frankincense, food, wine, oil, fine flour, and wheat, animals, beasts of burdens, sheep, horses, and wagons. Wagons are not an animal, but you get the picture here. And finally, the ultimate consumer product, slaves and human merchandise. And the idea here is that the list of consumer products in the economic realm, according to Richard, also reflects a scale of ethical values. At the head of the list is gold, and slaves and human merchandise constitute the ultimate value. The satisfaction of the vices of the rich and the luxury of Rome is what determines the ethics and scale of values of the great city. So the three powers that are now kind of recognizing that it's over for them are the political power, the economic power, but also the trading power of Rome. And the kind of picture that Richard wants to paint here is that Revelation is suggesting that there is actually a kind of like consumer satisfaction economy going on here. That Rome is held up not only by this kind of spiritual power, but also by the material consumption of stuff, especially luxury goods. And I think it's really interesting to not only note that there's a kind of like anti-consumerist thrust here in Revelation, but I mean, we just wrote this book about degrowth. I couldn't help but thinking about that as well, that there's like a kind of awareness of what economists call externalities when it comes to the economy, which is to say like the goods that we purchase have these kind of maleffects, like bad effects that we externalize, that we kind of put somewhere else in our brain. So for example, like whatever, you buy a t-shirt and it was made in a sweatshop and it uses bad materials that are bad for the environment, like plastics or whatever. When you buy that t-shirt, all of the kind of material bad stuff that go into it, they're not even usually in global north countries. We've kind of externalized it somewhere else. We moved all the yucky parts of production to a different part of the world, and therefore we can kind of enjoy our consumption that way. Well, I think what we have here in Revelation is something very similar. It's this kind of like refusal to let the externalities just be externalities. It's like the affirmation that there is human and material kind of stuff involved in the economy. And so the fall of Rome is bad news for those who want to keep those externalities external. It's kind of like the valorization of what is devalued by the empire. That's kind of what you see in the fall of Rome. So that really struck me as pretty profound and interesting.
It is really interesting. The liberation of all things, except for some people who are very sad bourgeois people at the top in Rome, I guess. I don't know. Yeah, it is super interesting. Well, so we have all of that going on. We have some people who are sad about it. We have some people who are happy about it. There's this word, there's a phrase I have underlined in here. I'll just read it really quick. In 22 and 23, we have a song of the people graphically describing the end of life in Rome. Gone are all the music, artists, craftsmen, lamps, shedding light, and wedding celebrations. In response to each proclamation, the people respond, "There will never more be heard in you. No life, only blood remains in Rome." And I thought that was really wild. It is just like a giant kind of like coming home to roost moment, though, where all of these externalities, they fall to the wayside. And then like, what does Rome have left? There's nothing, like, I mean, in the United States, we would say like, there's what's made in the United States, very little. And if all of these things, if all of these externalities were to fall apart, if the empire stopped commanding such respect and power in the world, what would be left in the United States? Nothing, only blood. And I guess the same applies here. Very interesting.
Yeah, it is. And maybe continuing with that blood theme, Richard goes on to say, verse 24 is the most remarkable in all of chapter 18. It provides us with the ultimate proof that Rome has been found guilty. This is the verse. In her was found the blood of prophets and holy ones, and all who have been slain on the earth. And then Richard comments, Revelation is concerned that justice be done not only for the blood of the members of the Christian community, but for all victims of the Roman Empire. And that's what's interesting too. So the blood that remains is not just it's not the satisfaction of vengeance kind of blood, right? It's not like the blood of all the bourgeoisie that have been whatever, put up against the wall or something like that. It's the opposite. It's like all the blood of the people who have been victimized by Rome. That's what remains in Rome. And that's also the kind of the substance that is drowning out all of the other sound and activity that happens in Rome. It's like, when you go to the shopping mall or something, that entire experience is just designed to alienate you from all the actual labor and natural processes required to get an object to you. So you go there and you see an advertisement for a new Marvel movie. You smell a bunch of perfume. I don't know. You can eat weird stuff at a food court that will produce a ton of garbage for no real reason. All this kind of stuff. And the idea is in Revelation, if you brought all that stuff up front, you couldn't just like have a good time at the mall. It's like it's the ultimate downer verse, you know? Like all the stuff that you do to like all the kind of work you do to put aside all that stuff, because you do need to participate in the economy to like live. You can't really put it aside anymore in the final judgment. So yeah, it really speaks to my inner like Christian anarchist who couldn't go to the mall without feeling bad about myself, and that's very dangerous to me. But anyway, it is a profound kind of final note here that the last judgment is like, what if you couldn't ignore all the blood that makes your life possible? Man, what an eerie kind of text.
Big time. Let's ignore it for now. Let's keep going. let's get away from this for a second. It's getting too real. Okay, so the last part of the triptych that we need to talk about is a big liturgy. So a big liturgical section where we have like the end of history. We're pivoting away from from all of the blood that does exist that undergirds the everyday life that we all share together, and we have sort of like the end of it all. Don't even worry about it. It's all over. God's in charge now. So in the liturgy, John sees everyone in heaven having like a big party. The liturgy recaps kind of the things that we've just talked about. It says that, you know, God has condemned the harlot, Rome. God has avenged the people. God has established God's reign. And then there's this like kind of extra thing. So not only is, you know, God's reign is like a particular political arrangement where like, you know, people who are just and righteous are in charge and all that kind of stuff. Great. But then there's something else that happens. There's the wedding day of the Lamb. I don't know exactly what it is like that turns me off about this particular metaphor. Maybe just it's like prevalent use. Okay, that's not it. That's not it at all. I think it's just the prevalent use of this particular verse and imagery in evangelical Christianity. I think the furries are more redeemable than evangelicalism for sure.
Definitely.
I have no problems with furries, but lots of problems with evangelicalism. I think that's it. That's what I'm trying to say here. So Richard says, in Matthew 22:2, we read that the kingdom of heaven may be likened to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son. In Isaiah's apocalypse, we also have a banquet in which Yahweh will destroy death forever and wipe away the tears of all faces. Yahweh's relationship with a new human society is expressed in terms of a husband and wife, and is very well known in the Old Testament, as well as Ezekiel, Hosea, Psalms, etc., lots of places. Then he finishes up saying, thus we have a man-woman or husband-wife relationship to express the relationship of Jesus as Lamb with the New Jerusalem. The contrast is perfect. The harlot, Babylon and Rome, and the beast standing against the woman, the New Jerusalem, and the Lamb. So there we go. We have this liturgical moment at the end. A very heteronormative thing at the end, I guess.
The Lamb and his smoking hot wife.
He won't shut up about it. I don't know if that's anyone else's experience, but when they tell you about sex in youth group, my experience was always that the youth pastor would never stop talking about his smoking hot wife, and it's just like, would you just come on? Would you just stop? Anyways, that's how this section of Revelation ends. I think there's probably a lot more to say about this particular thing. Dean, I'll give you the opportunity. What else should we say about this thing?
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot to say about it. It is all very interesting. The kind of like, okay, the corkboard of symbols here, I think is interesting to like kind of drag back out toward the end, because at the beginning of the book, like we said, you have the lamb that has been slain, and the lamb is the only one worthy to like really start this whole process. The lamb is the one that opens the first scroll, and everything kind of gets going from there. And then you have the lamb here at the end, finally kind of in union with the people of God who have struggled to remain faithful to the kind of martyrdom of the lamb the whole time. All that is very interesting. And then having this also kind of like counterposed of like, you know, the anti-lamb in the beast, and then the kind of anti-church in the picture of the harlot or whatever. It's interesting to be like, some of these symbols, they rhyme really well. Like in this specific triptych that Richard is pulling out, the symbols rhyme in some ways. The kind of like, as you said, the contrast between the two relationships But then there are also ways in which the symbols don't rhyme well at all. Like the harlot is not the people of Rome, whereas the church is the people of God, right? There's kind of these like things that like metaphors are kind of being deployed for some purposes and not all purposes. And that I think is actually an important interpretive key for reading Revelation, because I think there's a temptation to try to make everything fit together really neatly and compactly.
Yeah.
Rather than to figure out like, why is this metaphor being deployed at this specific moment in the narrative? And what is and isn't being pulled along through the book that creates some consistency in that respect. So that I've actually found really helpful in Richard's reading. Like, I do feel like he's kind of attentive to where those symbols kind of rhyme. And also, like, every once in a while, he'll go farther afield and try to find some other ways of making things rhyme that may or may not be, might not actually sound that good in the end. But I think in this case, all the kind of like gender stuff aside, which is not to say we shouldn't care about it, but just to put it aside to make this other point, I think that kind of rhyming is actually quite powerful. To be like, after all the suffering in the book, the kind of relationship that emerges is one between the slain martyr and then all the people who have been faithful to martyrdom. They kind of end up being the ones who are worthy of passing judgment and kind of inheriting the reign of God. That's really fascinating, but it does kind of, it all reads weird because the symbolism is just a bunch of symbols stacked on top of each other, all of them kind of serving different purposes at different times. And John is just like, I don't know, remixing them and seeing what happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. I think that's a really important bit because it doesn't fit together nicely. So you have to like, know what to take in and know what to skip over or know what not to try to pair up. But that is a really helpful note. Cool. All right, Dean, we're nearly through Revelation. Well, we're nearly through Pablo Richard's Apocalypse and also Revelation at the same time. So we're through nearly 2 books. It's rare that you get to read 2 books at one time, but we've been doing it right here through this whole podcast. What would you like to see resolved in this last section? What are you looking forward to? We only have the last chapter and the conclusion left. So, what are your expectations?
Yeah, well, I think what we haven't gotten to yet is what does the redeemed community actually look like when it doesn't have to deal with the Empire anymore. And I think, that's the conclusion of the book of Revelation. I'm sure it will be something that Richard talks about as well. But that kind of ongoing anxiety around how do Christians resist is maybe just a question that Revelation is not super concerned with answering. It does seem like, John's general kind of approach here is to just say, like, stay out of the circulation of violence in Rome and instead kind of create these counter circulations of, like being with one another, staying faithful to the Lamb, etc. So I think toward the end, I'm looking for maybe how to like square some of these things. Like if you've persisted as the Christian community through the Roman Empire, whether or not resisting it, looks one way or the other, what does that ultimately open up for you in building an alternative kind of society? So if Revelation is an anti-imperial book, I guess I'm wondering like, and is there a kind of like critique of the Gotha program that we can find in here? Like Marx too was like a great critic of capitalism, but he doesn't give you a whole ton of good blueprints about how to build socialism. Maybe John's the same, maybe not. I guess we'll have to see. What are you hoping for by the end of this, Matt?
Yeah, I've looked ahead a bit. I haven't read the end of the book yet because I wanted myself to be like surprised in the moment, or I want to be able to do a live react on the podcast, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But I have looked ahead, and there's a section heading called "What does the Book of Revelation mean for our time?" And I cannot wait to find out. I guess like that is, I mean, it kind of goes along with a lot of like what you're saying, what your expectations are. I would love to know what Richard thinks I should be doing with this book, because it's there's a lot of crossover, it feels like, for the times that we're living in. A lot of kingdomless kings out here showing up for this for this big beast, and that's going to be interesting. I guess I'm interested to know. The thing that feels so hard to me for this book is that there's so many vibes that I think really resonate with me from it. Lots of like sort of like critiques of imperialism, critiques of oppression that I find very useful. and they're, you know, kind of coming out of a prophetic tradition and group of people who are oppressed people. And I need to know, like, what is it I can do with this book, or should be doing with this book, as a person who is, you know, more or less not very oppressed. Like, I'm living up here in the global north. It's great. It's a great sunny day. I have a good job and a nice life, and everything is very cool. But like, you know, am I am I too on the side of the beast? Am I, like, you know, doing all of the wrong things? Would John be writing a letter to me in my church? I don't know. It's just interesting to try to figure out what exactly we should be doing with this text as people who are in drastically different contexts, and, you know, what we do with it all.
Yeah, I agree. We'll have to see next week. It does feel like one of those things where I'm kind of glad that it is canonized in the Bibles that we have, because I feel like, you know, there are so many weird people in the world, and you just kind of, I don't know, they say something weird at you, and you're like, I don't think so. I'm just not going to deal with that. That's like the experience of being on the internet, I guess, for me in general, just scrolling by and being like, I don't want to care about this person being crabby for some reason or other. But I do think it's great that the Book of Revelation decided to canonize this particular crabby person in such a way that you have to be like, sorry, you got to figure out what to do with this. So I guess that will be our challenge. That's a good challenge to have next time.
All right. I'll take it. I'll take that challenge. I'm going to have to, like, eat a really good breakfast and get my sleep the night before, because I feel like it's a big challenge. I'm not sure we're going to be able to solve it, but we'll see.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. You can buy our book, Enough is Enough, Degrowth, Capitalism, and Liberation Theology. You can get it directly from Fortress Press. You can get it wherever else you like to get books. It seems like you can order it pretty much wherever. I don't know anything about book distribution, but it seems... I did a little poking around on websites, and it looks like you can get it. Get it at your library. And let us know what you think. It'd be great to hear how it's being received. Our music is by Mario Armstrong. Our outro is by The Illogical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up.